I was mesmerized, frankly. And I thought, I decided I didn't want to be an accountant. I wanted to be a writer, and this would be a fabulous topic. So I started writing. I had this dream that I would write it in a year. Well, it took more than a year. And then I began working for our local museum, the Dubuque County Historical Society, which wanted to establish a river museum. And I had the good fortune to be the first full-time employee. There were so many demands on building that institution that it became really more of a pastime or a hobby at times. While some people were playing basketball or watching basketball or playing golf, I was trying to find out more information about Jim Bridger. And so while I was helping build this magnificent museum, I was also learning more and more about Jim Bridger. And I retired early from the museum so I could get this manuscript done. And it's really a great pleasure. It just was released yesterday. And it's very exciting. And so that's how I got into this. And I found out in my search that people on the East Coast and maybe along the Mississippi River Valley do not know very much about Jim Bridger. People in the Kansas City region certainly do. People in the far West know quite a bit about Jim Bridger. So there's a little dichotomy across the country. And of course, we've got a fluid population. So more and more people now are knowing about him. Many people know from the Bridger-Teton National Forest or towns named Bridger, Bridger Creeks, Bridger Schools. There was a Liberty ship named after Bridger. So he's more and more popular. I made the mistake once of saying to a group of teachers, educated or retired teachers, I bet none of you have ever heard of Jim Bridger. They all raised their hands, said, yes, we have. I said, how? She said, well, now he's in our school curriculum, which I didn't realize. So that's how I got started with this concept of, and then realizing that the books that were out there really didn't have the advantage of the last 60 years of scholarship. And that was a tremendous impetus for me.
Well, yeah, I don't blame you at all for wanting to tell his story. From what I know, it's a very fascinating story. So we know that Bridger rose from humble circumstances to become a famous explorer and mountain man. Where did Bridger come from, and how did he become a frontiersman?
At this point, what I'd like to do actually is read a little bit from the manuscript so you can get a sense of my style of writing. It's not overly academic. The very first sentence, I left home for the West when he was 8 years old. He had helped his parents keep a farm and an inn near Richmond, Virginia. Now he and his family were traveling nearly 1,000 miles looking for a new life in Illinois territory on the western edge of the American settlements. For Bridger, a brown-haired lad whose eyes were, quote, liquid hazel, bright almost to blackness, the move would change his life forever. By day, they followed dusty roads and rain-swollen streams. By night, they sought shelter and talked of dangers ahead. When the immigrants ran out of states, they crossed the territories, Indiana Territory, and then Illinois. The year 1812 was a dangerous time for the Bridger family to travel. The United States was 36 years old at that time, and it was in its second war with Great Britain. As the Bridgers moved west, the war moved west with them, and the British defeated the Americans in 3 significant encounters at Fort Mackinac, at Fort Detroit, and in a place called Chicago, which meant onion field. The Bridgers finally reached their new home in Illinois, and they settled in a place across from St. Louis, but in Illinois. It was called the American Bottom. Now, 3 tragedies interrupted Bridger's childhood. When he was 12 years old, his mother died. Shortly after, his brother died. And then he was 13, his father died. So he was orphaned. He and his sister and an aunt came to watch over him. He got a job on a flatboat, crossing people across the Mississippi River. Some people hunted wolves for 75 cents a scalp. He wanted to be on a flatboat, and so he obviously had a sense of adventure. Now, previous biographers have written that Bridger apprenticed to a somewhat nondescript blacksmith in St. Louis, and that's not true. Bridger apprenticed to a famous gunsmith named Philip Kramer, very close to Cahokia. He was one of the most skilled gunmakers on the frontier. Kramer was said to have a natural genius for working in metal. He was able to make all parts of a gun and put it together as if it had grown fast there by nature. In those days, a reliable person was said to be as sure as a Kramer lock. So one of Bridger's first jobs at the age of 12 was to go with Philip Kramer to the Illinois Indian Agency, a brand new Indian agency in Peoria, Illinois. And so he didn't live directly with the Potawatomis, but he was one of the few people who were living in that Peoria camp of Potawatomi Indians. And so these indigenous peoples who he had feared during the War of 1812, he realized that now he was actually helping them, make their living and do trapping and hunting and farming. So while Bridger was helping shape iron, his life among the Potawatomis was undoubtedly shaping him. Now living among them and interacting with them, this introduced Bridger to a peaceful coexistence that he would come to embrace throughout his lifetime. When Bridger was 17, he was ready for the next phase of his life. There was an ad in the Missouri Republican looking for 100 enterprising young men to go up the River Missouri and to stay there for 1, 2, or 3 years. At 17, Bridger signed up. He said he did it because he wanted to make money and send it home to care for his sister. If Bridger looked up the Mississippi, he could imagine the vast wilderness to the north. If he looked down the Mississippi, he could imagine it flowing hundreds of miles south to New Orleans. But he was destined to follow the Missouri, which flowed like chocolate springs reaching far west into the Rocky Mountains. On April 3rd, 1822, Bridger was one of the polemen on the keelboat, and the keelboat was being led by or captained by a man named Mike Fink. And Andrew Henry was also on the expedition, and he was leading the land crew. And that's when he started this, several 1,000-mile journey to the Rocky Mountains as an 18-year-old lad.
That's amazing. And I think I speak for many of the audience members when I say I'm hooked already, and I got to get this book.
Good.
That's quite fascinating. So actually, to speak to Bridger's early years, we already have some questions and observations from the audience.
Okay.
Bill, who joined us, is struck by the fact that a lot of explorers from this era and mountaineers were Virginians. They came from the state of Virginia. And he also wants to know, have you ever found out that Jim Bridger ever learned to read, or was he illiterate? So why do you think it is that so many of these guys came from Virginia? And also another question about the young Jim Bridger, did he ever learn to read?
Well, a number did come from Virginia, but there were several that came from Kentucky, like the Sublett brothers, William Sublett, Milton Sublett, Pinckney Sublett, Solomon Sublett. They all came from Kentucky. Jedediah Smith, I think he came from New York and then lived in Ohio for a while. So while Virginia, I'm sure, had many, there are many others who were coming as well. And then they were joined by French Canadians. They were joined by people from Dutch heritage. They were joined by people like Thomas Fitzpatrick and Robert Campbell, who came from Ireland. So they were really coming from all parts of the world. Bridger never did learn to read nor write, or that he asked someone to write and someone put some flowery language that Bridger would not have used. And there's other letters where you can tell it probably is exactly what Bridger was saying, and those were taken down. But he was never able to write his name, put his name on a contract. He put an X. He had people write for him. And yet he had this amazing memory of what it was like to travel through the West. And it was an encyclopedic memory. I can read a little quote. It's really quite amazing. This is from 1851. There was a great treaty of many of the Plains Indians brought together, perhaps the largest assembly of indigenous people in North American history. This man is a perfect original, and has traversed the mountains east and west and from the northern boundary to the Gila River. He was not an educated man, but seems to have an intuitive knowledge of the topography of the country, the courses of the streams, the direction of the mountains, and is never lost wherever he may be. That may be a little hyperbole. When the party of trappers wished to move from one stream to another, or cross the mountain to any stream or place, or when they were lost or uncertain, they always would appeal to Bridger. He would throw his gun carelessly over his shoulder, survey the country a while with his eye, and then strike out on the course, and never fail to reach the place, although he had several hundred miles to traverse over a country which he had never traveled and to places he had never seen. Pretty amazing, and there's dozens of accounts like that talk about that, so he was an autodidact in the sense that he taught himself the terrain and could recall it, but he never really did learn to read or write. But he was very proud that his, and they were educated in St. Charles, Missouri.
That's excellent. Wow. So this from a very young age, this young man is going west. And tell us, what were some of Bridger's, and this is a huge topic to explore, of course, but what were some of Bridger's greatest exploits in the West?
Well, by the time he was 20, he was the first Euro-American to discover Great Salt Lake. Other Euro-Americans had seen the lake from a distance, but they didn't know it was salt. He was the first one to go to its shores and taste it and realize that it was made from salt. When he was 21, William Ashley was coming back from the 1825 rendezvous, and he had, I think, about $30,000 worth of beaver pelts, and he wanted to take them safely. And they were traveling all up or following down the Bighorn River, which heads north. And they came to a place called Bad Pass. And it was called Bad Pass. The Crow Indians said that there was an evil spirit that lived there and would upturn any boat that would go through. Ashley asked for a volunteer. Bridger at 21 did volunteer. He made a little raft and he made that journey. And he's the first known person ever to make that journey on a raft. It's now been dammed. And so it's, you can't see the rapids that were there. So that was at age 21. At age 22, he was with a group of people under William Sublette, who were the very first to enter or discover what are now the current boundaries of Yellowstone National Park. Now, John Coulter saw many of those thermal wonders when he was on his way back in 1806 from being with Lewis and Clark. But this group went a little bit further, and they saw things like the Obsidian Mountain, and they saw the waterfalls, and they saw the geysers, of course, and the paint pots. And so it was among them. And he carried that story through his life. And many people consider him actually the grandfather of Yellowstone National Park, because he was the one who advocated it for about 40 years. And people called him just a big liar, that it didn't really exist. When he was 26 years old, he became partner of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. So this was the leading group of fur trappers. In 1843, he built Fort Bridger on the Oregon and California Trail. He guided a whole number of people. Then he turned to guiding. He guided Howard Stansbury and G.K. Warren. He guided Ferdinand Hayden, who was just a year earlier had been the first one to discover dinosaur bones, fossils, in North America. He was chief guide for what was called the Utah War. There were 2,500 soldiers under his leadership as guide. He usually got paid about $10 a day, whereas a soldier might be $1 or $2 a day, and the other guides were getting $5. He guided several U.S. Army generals and colonels during the Plains Indian Wars of 1863, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So he really had he had almost 3 careers, if you will. He was a frontier explorer and fur trapper and trader. He was a fort owner, and he was a scout, probably one of the most significant scouts in American history.
Well, if you're making a whopping $10 a day as a scout in the mid-19th century, you've clearly got a pretty good reputation.
Oh, yes.
And to speak to his travels, we have a couple of folks, James and I believe Peter, are wondering, did Bridger ever make it out to California?
He did. He went twice in 1840, and a man named, well, his name is spelled Frabe, F-R-A-E-B, but he was one of the partners. He was actually Bridger's partner. Bridger and Frabe, they called him Frapp. So Bridger and Frapp were partners, and they went with Joe Walker to California. Walker always had this dream of floating down the Colorado River and then going overland to Los Angeles. Well, they went overland, and then they went to the Pueblo de Los Angeles. And there's documentation of them trading some of their furs in exchange for horses. Horses and mules were quite prevalent in California, and they intended to bring them back. So that was 1841. In 1840, actually, I think a couple of years later, he hired he thought it was a friend of his, Pegleg Smith, who was going to lead a group of people down to the Coyoterra country. And that didn't turn out well, because when Smith came back, he wanted to keep the furs for himself. Bridger led an expedition to the Coyoterra country. Now, where is that? That is at the very end of the Colorado River, the mouth of the Colorado River. And for quite a while, historians were a little flummoxed, because the Hudson Bay records, they called it Q-U-A-T-E-R-A, but the Americans called it Cayos, like coyote territory, because that's what the indigenous peoples often ate to survive. And so there's this great tidewater area, which wasn't good for beaver trapping, was very good for shells. Currently, by the way, that area has so much that water has been drained off that sometimes the Colorado River doesn't even flow into the Bay of California. It's also called the Sea of Cortez. But Bridger was at that Sea of Cortez in 1845. So those are the two known trips to California. But when I say California, I mean the California we know today. Bridger in 1843 in the Mexican territory called California. The Mormons came out in 1847 and built their kingdom in Salt Lake City in the Mexican territory of California. It was huge. It encompassed our current states of California and Nevada and Colorado and Utah, and a whole slew of states were part of Mexican California. And what we know as California today, well, actually the Sea of Cortez actually comes in at the bottom of Arizona, and the Pueblo de Los Angeles, that is actually Los Angeles today. And was there a second part to that question, or did I answer that one already?
I believe you answered that question really well. There are some other questions about Bridger's, specifically how Bridger traveled. Jane would like to know, did he travel overland with covered wagons, or did he just ride a horse? How did he get around?
He rode a horse. I don't know these. I'm sure he must have been on a wagon occasionally. There's one occasion where he met Fremont's expedition, and he and some of his men, I think he was still on a horse, and some of his men were actually riding, or were on a wagon. He helped advise and guide several wagon trains, but he was almost always on a horse. And there's an incident about what he would do. So this is now 1865. Bridger rose early every morning and had a quick cup of coffee and some jerked meat. He saddled up and he rode to General Connor's headquarters to go over the route for the day. And he would relay the distance to the next camp, the contour of the route, and where the good water was found. Then he rode off alone or with a handful of men to look for Indian sign and plan the route for the following day. Often he didn't return until late and would immediately report. Then he cooked his frugal meal and found a place to sleep away from everyone else. So that's kind of his lifestyle on a horse. He did not live in a built home, a permanent built home, until he was 39 years old. He did not taste bread for 17 years. What many people, they spent a few years in the Rocky Mountains and then they went back to the settlements, or they went on to Oregon or to California. Bridger stayed among the mountains, and he was the grand, he knew so much knowledge about that he was invaluable.
Clearly, clearly. So Kate has an interesting question here, and we can see the cover of your book behind you. The photos of Bridger show him to be rather a striking looking
Yeah.
man. Kate would like to know, did your research uncover any descriptions of Bridger from those who knew him or met him back then? Physical descriptions or any information about his personality, things like that?
Yes, yes, yes. Let's see. So this is from 1837 at the 1837 rendezvous. The physical conformation of this man was in admirable keeping with his character, tall, 6 feet at least, muscular, without an ounce of superfluous flesh to impede its force or exhaust its elasticity. I guess this is 1837 language. It was ultimately published in 1845 in the Cincinnati Atlas. His cheekbones were high, his nose hooked or aquiline, the expression on his eye mild and thoughtful, and that of his face grave almost to solemnity. He goes on to say they were at a grand party at the 1837 rendezvous. There were trappers there. There might have been another 200 native Indians there. Both Iroquois and Delaware, who had come up from the east, as well as Shoshone, Flathead, Nez Perce. On the right sat, or rather squatted in Oriental fashion, one of the most remarkable men in this remarkable assemblage. This was Jim Bridger, the leader of the beaver hunting parties, with a thorough acquaintance of the whole mountain region, from the Russian settlements to the Californias. Bridger had a complete and absolute understanding of the Indian character based on his own large experience. To sum up, his bravery was unquestionable, his horsemanship equally so, and as to his skill with a rifle, he has been known to kill 20 buffaloes by the same number of consecutive shots. And this wouldn't be rampant killing. They would need 20 buffalo if they were drying meat for the winter. So this was actually a necessity, not just excessive hunting.
Of course, of course.
One more, and this is by Washington Irving. Bridger and his companions, they really had a lot of interest on the East Coast and actually in Europe as well. Washington Irving writes, a totally different class of men has now sprung up, called the mountaineers. They didn't call themselves mountain men, they called themselves mountaineers. The traders and trappers that scale the vast mountain chains and move from place to place on horseback, heedless of hardship, daring of danger, prodigal of the present and thoughtless of the future. There is, perhaps, no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement. So those are descriptions, and there's many, many more throughout the book of people met him. In fact, there's some descriptions of meeting Bridger from people who never met him. And because he was such a famous person, people go, I knew Jim Bridger, and the stories started to come out.
Of course.
Yeah.
So on that very subject, we have a couple of audience members who want to know more about how, the legend of Jim Bridger was created, things like that, different parts of the legend. So a couple of people are interested in, this whole story of how Bridger was the man. Was he the man who actually abandoned Hugh Glass after the famous bear attack on Hugh Glass? Of course, was retold in the movie from a few years ago, The Revenant. Could you speak about that legend and whatever truth is behind that? And you can bring in some of the other parts of Bridger's legend as well, if you'd like.
Sure. Well, I come down to say that I just don't know. I don't think it's known for certain. And in fact, the person who played Jim Bridger in the movie said the same thing in an interview, that historians are, not everyone agrees that it was Bridger. There were 3 people who Bridger knew very well, and they knew Bridger very well, and they wrote of the desertion of Hugh Glass, and not one of them mentioned Bridger. In 1837, 15 years after the incident, there was a person by the name of Edmund Flagg, and he lived in Cincinnati. He was publishing Louisville. He was publishing the Louisville Literary Newsletter, 1837. He just came into that job. And he went to St. Louis to try and find stories about the West. And he found this story about Hugh Glass. And so he said in that episode or that scenario that there was a young man named Bridges and an older man named Fitzgerald. But there are, in my book, I point out 7 extremely important errors in his article. And I tend to think, oh, so a young person, who went out west young? Well, by that time, Bridger had been written about by Washington Irving, and his painting had been painted by Alfred Jacob Miller. He was a famous person, and part of his fame was that he had gone out so young. And I guess to provide some kind of conclusion, Bridger was with a man named Stevenson, who was a naturalist for the Smithsonian Institution. And he was guiding Stevenson at the same time he was guiding G.K. Warren, who was trying to make perhaps one of the greatest maps in the American West, as well as Ferdinand Hayden was also on that, and he was looking for fossils. And so Stevenson said that he and Bridger, quote, tented and hunted together, he hunting for game as meat, and I hunted in the capacity of assistant naturalist in quest for mammals and birds for the Smithsonian Institution. Stevenson took an interest in Bridger and said he studied Bridger, quote, almost as an object of natural history himself. But there's a Professor Davis who was asking a number of questions he wrote to 20 different people across the country because he wanted to write a biography of Jim Bridger. And his papers are at the Madison, Wisconsin Library, State Historical Society. And so he wrote to Stevenson, and Stevenson wrote back one day, it was 1886, and it was a Sunday morning in Washington, D.C. And he said, I've been busy all week, but I came in to the office on Sunday. He was in the Castle building of the Smithsonian. And he said, I have time to answer your questions. And one of the questions was, did Bridger desert Hugh Glass? And he said, I know Bridger. Bridger told me about the Hugh Glass story, and there was no desertion. So from that, I take it to mean there was no desertion by Hugh Glass or by Jim Bridger. But there could have been. We don't really know for sure, but I don't think it's proven because there's really only one documentation, and it's by a person who wrote a very faulty history of the episode. So that doesn't necessarily by everyone, but history is an uncertain thing at times, and you just I mean, hopefully someday we will find out whether it was him or not. But I will say this: the young lad who volunteered, he was the only one who volunteered. He was 17 years old. Bridger was 19 at the time. He was 17 years old. And that showed tremendous bravery because they had just recently been attacked by the Mandans, and they had a kind of a frightening battle in the middle of the night. And then Henry, who was in charge of the party, said, we can't leave Hugh Glass with this young lad. We need someone else. No one else would come forth. And so then Henry said, all right, well, we'll give a purse of $40. Some people say 30, some people say 40. Edmund Flagg says $300. He also says that all the men chipped in their own money, which is not true at all. They wouldn't have done that. And Andrew Henry, who was the leader of the company, said, $40. So then Fitzgerald said, I'll do it then for $40. I definitely will. And it was Fitzgerald who said, let's abandon Glass. And Bridger said no. And Fitzgerald said yes, and we're leaving, and I'm taking all the rifles. And so the boy had no choice, really.
It's very interesting. So you mentioned this famous American Indian attack on the party that Hugh Glass and was part of. On the subject of Native peoples, we have a question from an audience member specifically asking if you ever traveled with the Potawatomi, but I know that Bridger had sort of a complicated relationship with Native Americans. Could you speak a little bit to that, like what his relationships were like with them?
Yeah, when he was 12 and 13, when he was 8 and he was traveling across the country, he was very fearful. There was a man named, he had a deformed hand, that's what it means. And therefore he felt he had a great spirit connection to the spirits. And he promised the Potawatomis would kill all the whites in the American bottom. And that must have frightened the 8-year-old Jim Bridger. When Bridger was 12, he was living with Philip Kramer among all these Potawatomis who were now peaceful because the war had ended. It was 1817. And so he was helping them survive, and he saw a different kind of relationship. When they first went up the Missouri River, it soon became known as the Bloody Missouri. Their horses were stolen by the Assiniboine. The Arikara had an attack and killed 13 of William Ashley's men, and Bridger was probably among a group that came down to help rescue them and resupply them with horses. They crossed they realized that they couldn't even travel along the Missouri River because of the antagonism or the conflict with the native peoples. So they went overland, and they met the Shoshone, who were very friendly. They met the Crow, who were very friendly. The Flathead were very friendly. The Nez Perce were very friendly. So Bridger's first wife, he didn't marry until like 1834. So he would have been 30 years old. And he married a Flathead woman named Cora, and she gave birth to 3 children. His next wife, she died supposedly from being bitten by a wolf. He married a Ute woman. Her name was Chipeta, which is a kind of a very well-known name among the Ute Indians. 1 child to that marriage. And then he married a young woman named Mary, or Mountain Lamb, is the family suggestion. Children with her. Initially, they were in great conflict with the Blackfeet. In later life, Bridger was very good friends with the Blackfeet and traded with them often. Bridger was also wounded severely by a Blackfeet blood Indian, and this is new information that hasn't been published, by a blood Indian by the name of Eagle Ribs. And it was a pretty dramatic encounter. You should read the book and hear about it.
I definitely will. And on the subject directly of your new book, we got an emailed question before today's event, and an audience member named Mary Pat said that she had already gotten the book, and she says that there's a story in the book because of a Crow man who struck a woman with a whip. This is in chapter 13 of your book, Night of the Rockies. A Crow man struck a woman with a whip because she was a woman in a Shoshone. The husband, Meek, shot and killed the Crow. Bridger chastised the husband, and then the camp was moved to another area. Was this typical of who Bridger was and the people that he knew in the West? And is it typical of some of the incidents that happened in his life?
Well, there was great animosity among different Indian groups. I mean, particularly between the Sioux and the Shoshone, for example. Sometimes this was just a male dominance idea, and so a woman married to Joe Meek would have privileges of trade goods and a horse to ride and everything. Maybe she was even richer than this Crow man, and that may have been what angered him, or maybe he was just angry. Those kind of occurrences happened a lot. Bridger's job was try to keep those things under control. A classic case of this was in 1838. Smallpox was decimating a lot of people, but particularly the indigenous people. And Congress did not ignore it. Just like today, we're getting vaccines. Congress authorized $12,000 to have doctors and boats go up with vaccines. But the money ran out by the time they got to the Dakotas, and they weren't able to save the Mandan, and the Mandan were almost totally wiped out. The disease continued to the Blackfeet people. And so Bridger was leading a group of trappers, and it was obvious that by the dead that they were leaving behind, this was a group of families, and they were suffering terribly from smallpox and dying. Joe Meek and Kit Carson and others, they were considered free trappers. So they weren't working on salary. They were just traveling along with Bridger. He had a lot of things to trade with them. And they wanted to follow them, and they wanted to get revenge because of fights they had had before. And Bridger did not want to do that. And he took his men off the trail, away from the Blackfeet who were suffering from smallpox. Carson was adamant, and so was Osborne Russell, and so was Joe Meek and several others. And they went and attacked and actually started a fight with these suffering men. They tried not to kill the women, but I think there was some of that as well. And this horrified the missionaries who arrived at Rendezvous a few months later. And Bridger was against that. And so in many cases, Bridger was a peacemaker and trying to say we need to get along. And there are others who wanted to take revenge. And Kit Carson was a tremendous scout, but he was a very impetuous person. And you'll find a lot of that. His character comes out in so many ways. He tried to avert the war with the Sioux Indians and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne by developing the Bridger Trail. And the U.S. Army and all the miners who wanted to go to Idaho and Montana, this was during the Civil War 63, they wanted to go through land Bridger had been before years ago, and it was called the Bozeman Trail. Bridger said, this is not right. We'll go through Crow Country. They will welcome us. They are my friends. And so he took 2,500 people on the Bridger Trail. Bozeman took 1,500 people on the Bozeman Trail, and 4 people died on the Bozeman, none died on the Bridger Trail. But the U.S. Army decided to go right through those lands of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho anyway, and Bridger was opposed to that.
Very interesting. So I think we're getting to the end of our time, but I have 2 very important questions I want to ask. So Kate brought this up, and I also was wondering this. You did mention that you found this previously unknown story of a wound that Bridger suffered. So what were some, and you made use of sources that have been uncovered since in the decades since the last major biography of Bridger. Mm-hmm. So what were some of these documents that you found, and what were some of the surprising facts that they revealed about Bridger?
Well, I made a list because I wanted to impress my publisher, and they agreed to publish because of this. The fact that when he was 12 years old, he lived among the Potawatomis. The statement to Stevenson that he was not the one who deserted Hugh Glass. The name of the Blackfeet Blood Indian, his name was Eagle Ribs, and he was a very famous Indian. His portrait was painted by George Catlin just the year before. Bridger searched for gold in Wyoming near Fort Laramie in 1833 and again in 1850, and he was interested in gold in Colorado in 1861. There's much more dramatic focus to the siege of Bridger's camp. 1 year after Davy Crockett and Bowie and others lost their lives at the Alamo, almost the same thing happened to Bridger and his 100 men, because they were surrounded by 1,500 who were going to kill them. Much more detail on life with Kit Carson, his spirited competition with the Hudson Bay Company. And so the fur trade went on for all through the 1840s, which people didn't know about that. It includes information like archaeology and pollen counts and women's roles at Fort Bridger, new information about his number of children he had and their actual ages, which are often misplaced. He was sued repeatedly, he and Vasquez, under Mormon-controlled forts for not vending the brand on horses sold. He went to Washington, D.C. to try and get his fort back. He was somewhat forced into or finagled into having to leave his fort. Brigham Young was so upset that he said that if Jim Bridger wants to come back to Utah, he may find himself strung up between the heavens and the earth. He noted many people, Warren, Hayden, Stevenson, Reynolds. He told them all about Yellowstone, and they put it in their diaries. Nobody believed him. The Kansas City newspaper editor was about to write the story, and he was told, oh, that's just Jim Bridger's lies, and refused to do it. After Yellowstone became a national park, he publicly apologized in the Kansas City newspapers. He had a very dangerous bout with pneumonia in 1855 at Sibley, Missouri, and he actually had to get off the boat, and he almost died. And just a year before, his good friend Thomas Fitzpatrick had died in Jim Bridger's presence. And there's lots and lots more new information. And so these come from the Bonneke Library at Yale University, the Huntington Library in Pasadena, the Missouri Historical Society, the Utah Historical Society, several locations all across the country. It's been a tremendous search, and it comes out as a whale of a tale. It's just all pure documented history.
That's excellent. Well, that's the very best kind of history. Um, So I have one final question, and an important one for us locally. Bill pointed out in the Q&A box that Bridger is buried in the sort of the greater Kansas City area. So how did he come to rest in this area?
Well, when he was forced to leave his fort, he and his Shoshone wife Mary and their children, Vasquez had already gone back from Fort Bridger, and he bought a property near Dallas, Missouri, which is right on the state line, Missouri and Kansas. And so Bridger came to Kansas City area, actually to Westport, north of Westport, and purchased property. He was selling a lot of livestock. Some of his payments were up to $3,000 to $4,000 of livestock payment, and so he lived from 1853 to his death in 1881 in the Kansas City area. And he sent most of his children, at least while he was out west, he sent most of his children to St. Charles, Missouri, under Robert Campbell's tutelage, and also Father Pierre de Smet. And there was a number of other people who were living in Kansas City area, also the Bents, others who had a Native American wife, and their children were of mixed race. And there's incidents actually when Virginia, once she was being counted at the census twice, because one in June she was visiting some friends who were also of mixed race. In July she was back at her house and shows up in that census as well. And so when he was buried, it was like a country, not very many people there. Grenville Dodge, a general railroad builder, he actually wanted to write, he wrote a good story about Bridger in 1804, and he actually paid for the monument in Independence, where the cemetery is. So his remains were removed to that location.
Excellent.
So he's a real Kansas City hero.
Yeah, and he's got a very impressive monument in that cemetery as well.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, and I want to, first of all, I want to apologize to all the folks. We've gotten so many great questions that we could not get to all of them. So thanks for participating, everybody. But Jerry, I'd also like to thank you for giving us this portrait of the real Jim Bridger.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoy it.
Well, I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Jerry's new book, Jim Bridger, Trailblazer of the American West, which has just been released. You can get the book through our friends at the Raven Bookstore here in Lawrence. The Raven is one of our partners for this program. You can find the book by searching on ravenbookstore.com. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you, Jerry, and we'll see you next time.
Very good.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Night.